Of the Rings of Power, the 7 Dwarven Rings are probably the ones that are the least spoken about. The importance of the one is self-explanatory. The 3 allowed the elves to maintain their realms much longer than they might have, and the 9 produced the Nazgul, Sauron's most terrifying servants. But the 7? We don't hear much about them other than the fact that Sauron considered them a failure and tried to take them back. But in this video, I'll explain how the 7 had a far greater impact than one might realise, and how the dwarves suffered because of them. Okay, so like I just said, Sauron considered the 7 to be a failure, not because the rings were faulty or anything, but because they did not affect the dwarves the way Sauron wanted them to. You see, the 7 and the 9 were functionally the same rings, all intended for the elves, but given to dwarves and men because elves were no longer an option for Sauron. The idea was the same though. Instead of using the Rings of Power to dominate elves, Sauron would instead use them to dominate dwarves and men. It worked on men, and as we know, Sauron ended up with the Nazgul. The dwarves were a different story. The Rings of Power affected the dwarves, but not in the same way. They did not shift into the spirit realm, so no invisibility. They did not artificially extend their lifespans, so they did not become wraiths either. But the most important difference is that dwarves were highly resistant to domination, so Sauron could not subdue them through will alone. While dwarves could be evil, and on several occasions did commit objectively evil deeds, it was always willingly rather than through subjugation. So from Sauron's perspective, the rings were a failure. He didn't bring the dwarves under his dominion, nor did he gain powerful new servants. But just because Sauron considered them a failure, that doesn't mean the 7 didn't end up causing plenty of problems. On the surface, the 7 seemed to be an incredible boon to the dwarves. It improved their works and craft, and they were able to gather more riches than ever before. However, dwarves also had a habit of being greedy, to the point of where it caused them to commit some truly vile deeds, and the 7 exacerbated this trait, and it was this greed that would be the undoing of the dwarves on more than one occasion. Perhaps the most infamous example of this was when they awoke Durin's Bane, the Balrog. In Gandalf's exact words, in their lust for Mithril, the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. It was the foundation of their wealth, so also it was their destruction. After awakening the Balrog, Durin VI was killed in 1980 of the Third Age, and Nain I died the following year, resulting in Durin's folk abandoning Khazad-dûm, their home of thousands upon thousands of years. Now, while one can't just blame the Ring of Power for this, it definitely played a role in driving the dwarves to delve too greedily and too deep. Without it, one could make the argument that dwarves never would have awoken the Balrog, or at the very least, it might have been many years later. Whether that would have made a difference is unknown. Durin's Bane is just one example though. In fact, the wealth of the dwarves would constantly bring them into conflict with a foe that was just as deadly, and that was the dragons. Dragons, like dwarves, had an extreme love of wealth and treasures. Even Glaurung, the first dragon, demonstrated this when he conquered Nargothrond and drove off the orcs that served him as he desired the treasure hoard for himself. Thus, it shouldn't come as a surprise that dwarves and dragons ended up as natural enemies. They both coveted the same thing, but whereas the dwarves worked hard for their treasures, dragons would simply use their vast powers to steal it from others. Even as early as 2000, the dwarves, or at the very least, Durin's folk, were coming into conflict with dragons. An infamous example was Scatha, who took a dwarven treasure hoard for himself, but was killed by Thram, then Lord of the Aethiode, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. As the legend goes, Thram and the dwarves would have a dispute over who the treasure belonged to, and although it's never confirmed, it is rumoured that the dwarves killed Thram. If this is true, it was simply another deadly consequence of the greed of the dwarves. But the largest conflict between dwarves and dragons did not take place until about 500 years later. This was the War of the Dwarves and Dragons. Since the loss of Moria, dwarves had been gathering and making permanent settlements in the Grey Mountains, then wild and mostly unexplored. By 2210, the main Longbeard kingdom had been established there, but in 2570, probably drawn to the wealth and prosperity of the dwarves, dragons reappeared in force and made war upon them. 19 years later, King Dain I and his second son Thror were killed by a cold drake. The following year, King Thror, the famous king under the mountain, would lead the majority of his people back to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. As you might have guessed, this was not the end of Thror's run-in with dragons. As king under the mountain, Thror became exceedingly wealthy and that wealth passed beyond the mountain to Northman cities such as Dale and Esgaroth. Unfortunately, this drew the attention of none other than Smaug, and in 2770, late into Thror's reign, he descended upon Erebor and Dale. Both cities were sacked and abandoned by their inhabitants, and Smaug took up residence inside Erebor. Thror's vast hoard of treasures now belonged to him, the legendary Arkenstone included. Incidents with dragons were not isolated to Durin's folk. Unfortunately, the other dwarven clans also weren't so lucky. The Silmarillion puts it quite simply. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hoards of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring, but all those hoards long ago were plundered and the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire and some Sauron recovered. So as the Silmarillion would lead us to believe, every dwarven clan did the same thing Durin's folk did. They used a ring of power to amass a vast hoard of wealth, but inevitably, they all ended up drawing the attention of dragons or other evil creatures, and their hoards were plundered or destroyed. As for their rings of power, we know that 4 were destroyed by dragons, and 3 were recovered by Sauron, one of which was the ring that belonged to Durin's folk, taken from Thrain when he was taken prisoner in Dol Guldur. So, the Dwarven Rings, the 7, they were incredible tools that allowed the dwarves to build these vast hoards of wealth, but they were also the catalyst of their destruction. But one could ask, is this truly the fault of the Dwarven Rings? If the rings just exacerbated the natural traits of the dwarves, then surely the dwarves would have ended up building vast hoards of wealth regardless, and surely that would have inevitably lured dragons. My answer to that is, I don't know. The problem is that we don't know how important the 7 were in regards to building these vast hoards of wealth. We don't know how much they helped, we don't know if they changed the dwarven mindset, or if they changed how the dwarves handled their wealth. It's certainly possible that the 7 merely accelerated the inevitable. Yet at the same time, one must look at Dwarven history. Before they received their Rings of Power, the dwarves had it fairly good, especially compared to elves and men. But after they received their Rings of Power, Dwarven history becomes fraught with conflict and cataclysms, especially late in the Third Age. And those said cataclysm and conflicts are all the same: loss of homelands, wars with dragons, wars with Sauron, and in the end, every single Dwarven clan loses their Ring of Power. So, is that just a coincidence? Or did all the dwarves share the same fate because they all shared those same accursed artifacts? A useful tool that doubled as a ticking time bomb. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I really like the 7 Dwarven Rings just because of what they demonstrate. Sauron saw them as a failure because he didn't get what he wanted out of them, but they were ultimately still artifacts of evil, so even by unleashing them onto the world, they still did plenty of harm and got a lot of people killed. Maybe for a while, the dwarves could use them for good, but there was a price to be paid, and damn did they pay it. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you want to generate wealth, be a dragon, go to a bank, set everyone on fire, refuse to leave.